Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Executive into the Mystic. Today, we are going to be talking about what it means to actually become a C-suite executive. Whether you're a CEO, a CFO, a CMO, whatever, we're going to be talking about vision, perspective. What is the mentality that you need internally and externally in your company in order to be able to make that leap or to continue to be the best CEO that you can possibly be? Enjoy. The Executive and the Mystic podcast, co-hosted by LeFranc and Kristina Wiltsee, where wisdom meets business.
Hi, I'm Fred, and I'm the executive.
And I'm Kristina, and I am the Mystic. Welcome to the Executive and the Mystic podcast, where wisdom meets business. First off, I want to introduce my co-host, Fred LeFranc, who is an incredibly open-hearted, surrendered, generous being who is also incredibly savvy and capable of being able to advise CEOs and executives and people in the restaurant industry, but also all in many different industries with his chaos strategy, being able to see paths where other people can't.
Oh, thank you so much. And my co-host is Kristina Wiltsee, who's a perspective optimist, which basically means she helps all of us, me specifically and other executives, look at life from different angles to maybe understand things from a different point of view or broader, or more importantly, more altitude to really understand what's happening on the ground. And so we're excited to start today's conversation. And today, Kristina, what are we talking about?
So today what we're going to talk about is something that I find really fascinating. And it's this kind of je ne sais quoi when it comes to business in particular, which is what are the qualities that make a C-suite executive or a CEO in particular? What is the difference between somebody who's an SVP or a VP, and what makes it so that they can then become a CEO? And Fred, you have a lot of experience working with people to upskill into the C-suite, right? But as well as doing a lot of mentoring of people in the C-suite. And I have a similar perspective, but from a more personal development perspective of like, what are the qualities that can kind of, that you point out in terms of vision or all these other things that you're seeing in CEOs and how I help people do that. So we're going to be combining our two specialties, really doing it from the lesson of seeing is how do you become, if you're not a C-suite executive and that's what you want to do, what is the difference in mentality and skills and talent that they have versus somebody who is not?
Good. Well, let me start off with one thing. You are never ready to be a CEO or be part of the C-suite. You never are. It's a choice. It's never like, okay, I went to school and I'm ready, I got my little diploma. You are never ready. And most people, quite frankly, get thrown into it. Some circumstance happens where you are the acting CEO, whatever the executive role would be, or something, other drama occurred. And so it's like, hurry up and get ready. So let's just talk about some of the qualities. I'm going to start with Kristina first, because we're going to take it from the personal to the professional. Mm-hmm. We'll sort of interplay that a little bit. So I'm going to start with Kristina to talk about what the mindset needs to be, the emotional state to step into a higher level role where you now are leading your peers potentially, or you're taking over an organization where someone was let go and there might be, some calamity or something going on. So Kristina, take it away.
So I would say that in terms of my understanding of what is the difference from the people who I work with who are not yet in the C-suite and those who are, is that there can be a lot of, you bring a lot of your stuff with you. Let's just say this. You don't you don't leave all your baggage back in the other places and the other roles, right? It's, there's a lot of understanding of the fact that the higher that you get in an organization, the more hyperbolic your issues become, meaning as in like the more amplified they become because suddenly they have a much bigger kind of impact on everybody around you, because you're not just making a decision for your team or for your department, you're making a decision for a whole company. And depending on how big that company is, those issues can become extremely amplified. So in the very most basic way, I think knowing yourself as much as you can, whether that's by doing your own work and being self-reflective, which is always a wonderful quality to have, or getting the help of somebody else to help you see your qualities, is a very important mindset, to be willing to recognize that you don't know all the answers. You're not supposed to be infallible. You are meant to be a growing and learning being. You are meant to be in a growth mindset because you yourself have to grow, and therefore you have to facilitate the continual growth of a company that would go underneath you. What do you think about that, Fred?
Well, you stated one of the things that's really important to understand is a lot of first time CEOs that I encounter think they have to have all the answers because of their role. They assume that the CEO is all knowing, all powerful. It's like, Moses with the stone tablets coming out of the corner office with, here, go make it so. It doesn't work that way. And this is hard because on one hand, your ego is fulfilled that you're now the CEO. On the other hand, you're scared to death that you're now the CEO. And to admitting, I don't know, is not necessarily the first thing you want to try and do. And so this is where I think the emotional state of being vulnerable is fine, but intellectually remain curious and just go ask questions, ask people information. And I think one of the best books that I've ever read is The First 90 Days, which is a good book to help people understand how to approach it. There's a methodology in there. Kristina's talking about sort of that emotional state and the willingness to seek answers from other people. But the process is to go on the listening tour, ask questions. And depending on the circumstance, because let's face it, if the situation is very fluid and very intense, you got to move fast.
Yes.
And I will say to you that it's really, really important to stay as centered as you can and not to pick up the role of any one emotion, whatever that may be. I've met people who get into hubris really quickly. They're all powerful. Here I am. I'm going to fix everything. My predecessor was a fool. I have all the answers. That's a bad one. Or, good Lord, I don't know what to do. I'm paralyzed. We don't want to do that. We want to just be intellectually curious and look at the entire spectrum of the organization. So, send it back to you, Kristina.
I think it's a really interesting thing, and I think it's a very good thing if we were to kind of give some hot tips of like, what are the things to do when you're going into a CEO position? Know that inevitably everybody will always villainize the person that came before them as a default. You not doing that is a wonderful, wonderful first step, right? Because again, there's a level of self-reflection that is absolutely going to be necessary as you go into this. And you're absolutely right. There's so many circumstances in which somebody's like, you have to immediately show that you have all these qualities. And if you get wrapped up in the kind of blowing up of ego, which they inevitably do, right? The kind of inflating of ego that they inevitably do to a new CEO, whether you're a publicly listed company who obviously they're trying to create a marketing story around you coming into CEO, or most likely the case, or more often the case, which is you're going into a company that has private equity, something along those lines. So it's not you're needing to impress a certain number of people, but not everybody, right? Not a market. And so knowing that that's the case, you need to recognize that all of the inflation that's happening for you, again, it's not only going to inflate your good qualities, it's also going to inflate your the qualities that maybe you still need to work on. We won't say bad qualities.
Or your weaknesses. I mean, first off, separate role from person. That's an important consideration. People are responding to the role. You are now the CEO. It's the role they're responding to. You just happen to be in it. Okay, so
Yes.
that's an important distinction. The other thing is to recognize that you are in a business. You are in a symbiotic relationship with an external host, the world, the market, right? Your customers, the environment, the economy. And you need to be keenly aware of what's happening there so you can look at how the company's positioned and how the team is focused to, sort of enact your plans, whatever they may. So that's it. So perspective is really critical externally and internally. If you look at the external situation clear-eyed, the competitive environment, the economic situation you find yourself in, the financial results you have as a business, that will allow you to at least assess things clearly and to begin to form a plan and engage your team in that plan. One of the things Kristina said at the beginning is true is that in my work, the personality of the CEO is a thumbprint on the culture. And what you're balancing is not just performance, operational, and financial results. You're also looking at the culture. Can you rally the team behind you? Will they follow you? Now they will. They say they will. They always will say that. But do they in fact do that? Becomes a big part of what you're trying to do, and to start really assessing them very quickly. So your perspective does shift very rapidly when the pressure of that role comes in. It's like anyone underneath the CEO can be critical of the CEO because they don't feel the stress that the CEO has. Basically, it's like sitting in a room, all of a sudden the roof's gone off your head. There is no more protection. Okay. You are responsible to the board or the PE sponsor, and you're responsible for the entire organization and its well being. That's a big responsibility. And until you have that responsibility, you really don't feel it. So it's important to sort of get yourself prepared for that. What tips would you have for a executive who finds themselves immediately in a situation of turmoil and stress, Kristina, to get themselves centered so they stay like a lighthouse that calm in the storm?
So when you get into those situations, it's very easy to what we would say activate our limbic system, our survival brain, right? Because suddenly your job, your life, we have a very hard time sometimes separating the role from who we are, and we feel like we can be in a very survival state. In which case, the natural tendencies of going into a survival state are present, right? Which is that you may for some people, they may stop trusting people. They may kind of like shut down and like say, oh, I have to try and get control of the situation, sort of thing. Some people may not be able to kind of find that they have all their faculties. They may not be sleeping. They may not be able to do self-care. And so what we recognize is that getting into a space in which you internally feel a sense of coherence or calm, or you can feel that you're no longer in that survival state in which you can actually affect your stress response on a daily basis, is a very important starting place. So that's something that I say all the time to people is I say, okay, what are the practices that we have that despite all of the activity that happens during the day, in your core that you are anchored to something inside of you that is unchangeable, regardless of the experiences that are happening outside. For some people, that's their faith, right? For some people, that is whatever faith they choose, that is the core of them. I oftentimes encourage people to find a core that sits outside that is a faith in themselves, not necessarily in their earthly capabilities, but in their kind of, and whatever it feels like is a more lasting or eternal or steadfast anchor inside of them, as a really good way to look through those times so that you can be buffeted by any winds, no matter what.
Yeah. So I've been involved in many dynamic situations, either as a CEO myself or with clients where the stress is just unbelievable. It's that you get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, like, what am I going to do tomorrow? I'll tell you right now is lower your expectations. Don't lower your standards. Focus on the 1, 2, or 3 things if you get that high. Sometimes just one thing that you can do to move the piece forward on the board. But let's start with the perspective you need to have. First off, anyone in the C-suite has to have a temporal view that's at least 2 years out. And I sort of push my hand out in front of myself, way out there as far as I can stretch it to say, I got to think 2 years out. Because if you need to have a clear vision of what you want to achieve, that is going to be a long-term vision. And if you're thinking 2 years out, the decision you make today against that perspective, that long-term view, will be different than if you're looking 3 months out. Because the crisis at the moment will make you do things that, while you think will resolve the current issue, which it does, it may create a longer-term problem. And I've seen this happen repeatedly, where all of a sudden, 2 years goes by and that decision made 2 years ago now creeps out. What's an example of that? You sign a bad lease and now you can't move that location. That's a tough one, right? Or you made an impulsive hire and someone that filled the need immediately may not have been the solution for you long-term because they couldn't grow into the role. Because again, this is a dynamic environment. We're not talking about so you're sitting calmly as this is going on. It's raging around you. So having a long-term view is important. The other one is to look at your organization holistically. If you remember in a crib, a baby usually has a mobile where things move up and down and spin around. And if you pull on one end of a mobile, the other end goes up. That's how business is. The dynamics it's almost like a spinning solar system of activity that's going on. And so having systems intelligence, which is what that phrase is. So look at the system, understand the ramifications. As one piece moves, the other piece moves. Now, the good thing about systems intelligence is you learn to stop wasting energy. You see that with little touches here, little touches there, you can get better performance throughout. I led a meeting last week with a group of executives, and we're sitting in a large conference table. And I said, I want to illustrate to you how you've been running your business. So I said, all right, the table weighed about 300 pounds. All right, so this half of the table, I want you to lift this table 3 inches off the ground, okay, parallel to the floor, cannot tilt. We're on the other side looking at you. We're going to lean on the table. Now, this is a setup. And of course, they lift it and it goes up 6 inches and they're all excited. And I said, but did you accomplish what I requested? Is it parallel to the floor? And they said, no. And of course, they told me all the reasons why I couldn't be. So that's fine. We'll do the same thing on our side. So we did. Same thing happened at Tilts. We raised it off the floor. There we are. So now let's do something really different. I want you to everyone get up to the table because you can't stand up, you can't use your legs. Take 2 fingers, put it on the table, and there's women involved just as well as men. On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, lift. We lifted that table a foot off the floor, perfectly parallel. I said, now here's the visceral experience you had. What was the individual effort? And it was minor, 2 fingers. It was very easy. Again, even the ladies said the same thing. I said, what was the collective result? And they said it was enormous. I go, that's how you need to run your business. We run our business because we're not in collaboration. We're not communicating. It's disjointed. It's not clear what we're trying to do. But when you do it in harmony with one another, with this clarity and collaboration, there's a common goal and a purpose, the individual effort is small, the collective results are huge. That's exactly what you're trying to do within your organization in doing so. So having that holistic understanding, the systems of intelligence piece is critical so that when you're going toward that long-term vision 2 years out, you are, and by the way, you don't march in a straight line. It's a zigzag. That's how life is. Go ahead, Kristina.
No, it's great. I was going to say, Fred, I can lift more with my 2 fingers than I can say probably 50% of men. So I'm going to have to call you out on that one a little bit. There's no caveat needed for women.
That's right.
No, but I think that's a wonderful perspective, because what we're kind of saying, if we wanted to kind of holistically take a perspective shift on what we're talking about here today, is we're talking about how when you are in a department or when you're running a department, every single time that you get promoted to have more and more of a sphere of influence over a group of people within a company, right? Depending on how big the company is, you're having to shift your perspective and you're having to change your altitude, right? You're having to get a higher view of what it is. We've talked about this idea that first you need to be self-reflective, right? And oftentimes getting that higher altitude allows you to be self-reflective and say, like, these are my weaknesses. These are my, I'm not supposed to have all the answers. I'm not suddenly at the top of this mountain and I'm up here by myself. It's like, no, I can be self-reflective, recognize that I need to get the best people possible around me to be able to help support me in this position, but it's not about me having all the answers. It's about an understanding of what has happened in the past that has led for you, not just you as an individual, but what has happened in the company in the past to lead you to be in this position. Why are you being chosen to be in that position? So you have a very good understanding of the past. And then you also have this temporal view that you're talking about of the future, right? Recognizing these dynamics of you're having to understand a system, and you're having to understand how one move over here is going to change this move over here. If you're so myopic that you can only see yourself and what you do in any given moment, or you're not able to see the past, the future, and those dynamics that are going on, you're not going to be able to successfully navigate this new position of having to have all this altitude and not really necessarily know how to go and it'd be very similar to like, oh, I'm in a paraglider suddenly, and it's like, how do I steer this thing? Like, what is this? If I go this way, then all of a sudden I'm going pretty far to the left. Am I neglecting everything that's on the right? Can I see do I have the visibility to see forward? We, have increasingly in the last 5-10 years been going through times in which it feels like you can't gain that temporal view of what's going to happen. And I know, Fred, you've gone through a lot of positions like that, right? Where it's very, very difficult to gain that temporal view of the future. What would you say to somebody who is going into a CEO position or is in a C-suite position about what happens when you feel like you can't see that far in the future, where it feels like it's cloudy?
Yeah, you bring up a good point. Having a vision for your business does not necessarily dictate and determine exactly the form it's going to take. It's like a movie in your mind. It should be as clear as a movie to say, what kind of company are we going to be within 2 years? And if we are that type of company, what can we achieve? All right. So it's linked between kind of what the company represents in its state of awareness and being, as well as the results that one would have. I at a meeting in January saying the team that's at this table today will not be the same team in December if we achieve our goals. And they kind of looked at me like, are you replacing us? I said, no, you're replacing yourself. You're going to grow. You're going to change. You will not be the same person, because the team that can achieve the results we're shooting for has to be dynamic, has to be, nimble, has to be intelligent about the business, needs to know what to focus on. And we are not that yet, but we will become that. The other thing too is I mentioned at the very beginning, you're never ready. It's a choice. But what you can do to prepare, okay, you can do some things to prepare. And the first one is I do a 2-question exercise when I talk to people who would like to be in the C-suite. And the very first question I ask them to write down and answer is, if I were the CEO of this company in its current state and condition, what would I expect from my role? And I make it a point to focus on roles, not names, because people make mistakes all the time. They become these kind of cults of personalities. And that's an error, because if you try to chase someone else's personality, you never catch it, because they didn't even know themselves most of the time. But the
Hmm.
role fine in terms of what his job is, what is his purpose, what is there to do. So if I'm not a CEO, but I'm in a lower position, but if I was the CEO, what would I expect from my role? It's amazing to me when people answer that question, how many times they come back and say, you know what, I'm not doing enough. I really realize that I'm not fully supporting the CEO's expectations of my role in the way I need to. I need to be broader. So that's number one. Second question, if I were the CEO, what would I do in this situation? And immediately that systems intelligence piece comes in, because you have to look at it holistically. If you're not a great team player, you're not going to be a great leader, because you cannot lead people who don't know how to play well together in a box. If you've got a lone wolf who's just doing things on their own, they're going to be very disruptive and toxic to the culture. So answering the question, if I were the CEO, what would I do, really gives you that 2-year temporal look, as well as a broad scope of the whole organization to look at the dynamics. And you begin to appreciate it. I did that exercise years ago. I think I was 23 years old. And I spent an entire weekend, writing this all out. And I remember going into my boss and saying, I have failed to do my job properly. Let me tell you what I will do going forward. And he was like, well, good for you. That's exactly what you weren't doing. But then I said, by the way, you have a lot of problems. And he goes, what do you mean? I go, you got a lot of problems. Let me tell you now what I've done in answering the question. If I were in your role, what would I be looking at? And we ended up having this incredible 3.5-hour session where I was able to share that, and he would ask me these wonderful revealing questions. And that's really important. That's that perspective that we talked about in terms of how to have that mindset of the CEO. The emotional state, I think, is critical to understand. You need to be a lighthouse in the storm, because everyone, it's like on an airplane. If you've ever been in an airplane with turbulence, and you look at this at the flight attendants, they're calm and they're talking to each other, then calm down. If you see the panic look on their face, then you better start worrying, because they're the indicator of what's really going on. They're experiencing that. And the CEO's in that same kind of role. People will look to you for the leadership. Now, the inside may be churning and full of questions and anxiety, but on the outside, you got to stay fairly calm in terms of what you need to do. You need to be decisive. You need to ask questions. And that's why the CEO always speaks last. They get input from everybody else first, and then they say, this is what I've decided to do once they've heard everyone else's input. The worst CEO is going to say, this is what we're going to do, damn it, and just follow me because I told you so. That's never effective in what you're trying to accomplish.
Yes, yes. It's so funny because the thing that I love about the idea of the executive and the mistake as a podcast, just to kind of get meta here for a second, is this idea that business is any different than life in all its qualities, right? So you're talking about sitting in front of a group or a team of people, and you are saying you're going to be a different person than you were back then, right? Like you're going to find yourself that the person who's sitting at this table is not going to be the person that's sitting at this table 8 months from now. I've had a similar conversation recently with my partner, right? We're in the middle of kind of this house building adventure, and this understanding of the fact that even the person that we were 6 months ago is completely different than the person that we are right now. I always say that I am not the same person who married my husband, and he is not the same person who married me, right? And so we see these parallels between business and our non-business life, if we want to say that, right? But really we recognize that this compartmentalization of one versus the other is kind of hogwash, because what Fred's just said is stuff that we can take into our own life for our marriages, for our parenting. Great. You just talked about authoritarian parenting, right? Like that's a classic example of like what it means to be like, in many ways, we've been conditioned for authoritarian parenting for generations, where it just says, I'm the person who knows best. I'm the one who's going to do this, and this is how it goes. But what we recognize is that, as always, there's a pendulum swing. There's a pendulum swing from authoritarian parenting to negligent parenting, which is a lot of what happens in the 80s, all the way back to what we would call gentle parenting, or it's actually permissive parenting. A lot of people misinterpret it like, oh, you're sad. Okay, we're going to change everything in the world so you can be sad. And the same thing happens with being a leader, as with leading a family, is that you start to recognize that there is a healthy middle ground, and we're constantly recorrecting generationally. And our job as leaders is not to be authoritarian, which is, again, a couple iterations ago, if you want to look at it in terms of parenting and kind of what's socially acceptable or what people kind of typically do, and recognize that being a leader means that you need to take everybody's reality into account, have age appropriate consequences is very much a parenting term, but we'll say appropriate consequences for, and appropriate consequences for when things don't necessarily go the way that they need to. You're not just being permissive and saying, okay, well, that's going to happen. There's a consequence as a result of it. And also this understanding of what it means to be a person who takes everybody's reality into consideration, consolidates them, and comes up with a path forward, knowing that your job is to be the vision holder, but that you also are taking into account everybody's view. And those are the healthiest cultures, are the ones that effectively allow healthy debate, that allow everybody to freely speak, that allow everybody to say, this is my reality, and I'm not gonna have a strong emotional reaction or a strong, you're not gonna have these really strong consequences for telling me that something's all awful and wrong over here. Everybody's allowed to freely speak, and those cultures are exactly how you would run a family, how you would run a marriage, and how you would run a business.
This episode is brought to you by Results Through Strategy. Since 2006, RTS has been the go-to partner for restaurants and food service brands, navigating growth, transformation, or recovery. Their team of seasoned industry veterans helps companies rediscover their purpose, realign with their values, and implement strategies that build measurable, sustainable performance.
Yeah, I think one of the primary functions of anyone in a leadership position at all levels of the organization is talent development. Is to make the people that report to you stronger, more self-reliant, exercise better judgment. And so I distinguish between who you report to and who you work for. People may report to you, but you must work for them. If you are working for the benefit of your people to make them better at what they do, they will support you. Your career depends on these people. And, whenever there's a question to see, let's talk about some individual they're concerned about it. So, you're betting your career on them. They go, well, no, I'm not. They said, yes, you are. You're keeping them there, right? I'm not saying terminate people. Just go have that conversation with them about performance. And I always separate it between being a kind leader and being a nice leader. Nice leaders are terrible leaders. They're seeking approval and validation for their subordinates to like them as a person. That is not the way to lead an organization. A kind leader is, I respect you, I treat you with dignity, I care about you, but I'm going to hold you accountable to results. This is a business after all. And that's about growing up emotionally to say, no, I've got to tell you how you're performing or not performing based on the agreement that we have. I mean, that's all it's all about. These are agreements. You have joined our company in a certain role. I have a certain role in the company. The agreement with the board of directors that I must perform to the expectations of the board, which generally is always so tied to some numbers. There might be some other qualitative things, but the quantitative ones have a tendency to take hold. And I would say at the same time, in terms of judgment, keep in mind that numbers don't tell the whole story. You cannot manage a business by P&L. It's like driving a car through the rearview mirror. You got to look through the windshield, and that's where leadership comes in. Where are we going? Why are we going there? Why does it matter? What difference is it going to make? And how will it transform our business? How will it transform us as individuals? So helping people develop better judgment and working for their benefit is something that I can't even tell you how priceless that is. And that will contribute to culture. Culture is the secret sauce. In all organizations. My metaphor for culture is we're all standing in a swimming pool and we got to keep the water clean. Everyone's responsible for culture. Therefore, there is no peeing section in the swimming pool because what you do in one end of the pool goes everywhere else in that environment, in that culture, what you have. And if everyone's really respectful and mindful of that, you will grow. And by the way, The companies with the strongest cultures and the disciplines in business are the ones that are the phenomenal companies of today's world. The ones that are toxic, just go away. You cannot survive with a toxic culture in today's world. You might get away with it for a while. You can have, you could have a kind of a company that's just focused on being really, really smart, but not being healthy. But they eat their young, and ultimately catches up with them. You need both pillars of health and intelligence to guide a business going forward. And the CEO is responsible to monitor both at the same time. So your awareness of yourself, your self-awareness, and then the awareness of the relationship you have within your team is very, very important to lead to greater results.
Do you feel that there is a consistent answer for if you go into a company who has issues with both intelligence and health, what you would say that they deal with first?
Health.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. A healthy team has got each other's back, and they'll support each other. A really smart team without any moral compass, they just, like I said, they eat their young. They'll backstab. It's a very political environment. Health's very important. So what does that mean? You walk into a situation that's a mess, is you start asking people questions. What would you do? What's going on? And make sure that they understand you're really paying attention to it. It helps to have the same set of questions for everybody, so you have a nice benchmark of it. Don't just let the conversation wander aimlessly. When you talk to them about their personal lives, let it go where it's going. Some are married, some are not, some have kids, some don't have kids, whatever the case may be. But in terms of the business aspects of it, what would you do? You ask them a series of questions in terms of their role, their contribution, changes they would propose, why they would propose those. There's a great exercise called stop, start, and continue. What would you start doing that you're not doing? What would you stop doing that you're doing? What would you continue doing only better? And those kind of questions as a process allow you to get a lot of information as a leader. And then I said earlier at the beginning, having a vision of where you want to go is really, really important, because that does give you sort of that guiding light and sort of the North Star, along with a sense of purpose. Why are we doing this? It's not just to make money, okay? I mean, people, when they start off in business, get a job to make money to pay their bills. I got that. But there's a difference. You finally have meaning in your job, because it gives you a greater sense of purpose, and it gives you an intrinsic reward, not just an extrinsic reward. I really feel proud to work here because my company takes care of each other, takes care of its guests, takes care of the community at large. That's that stakeholder mentality that Conscious Capitalism talks about. That is a very, very powerful driver. That's the wind in the sails. Okay, managing the rudder is all the technique, the operations, the standards, the SOPs, the so forth and so on. So that's also as important. They're both very, very important. But if you don't have wind in your sails, you're just dead in the water. If you want to move forward from the energy of the people within the organization. Now, when you have an external circumstance that's really challenging, a competitor or the economy and stuff like that, that also unites people against a common cause, and that'll get you along for a certain way. But ultimately, the better one is the one that's initiated within yourself and as your organization, to say, we are here to change the world in our way, whatever that may be. And sometimes, making widgets, serving burgers doesn't sound like it's going to, change the world dramatically, but you'd be surprised what it can do. This is where kindness comes in, where your service to your fellow man, you contribute to the quality of their life. Because the number of employees you have is not the number of people that you're concerned about. The number of employees, add all their family members. That's really the census of what you have to focus on from the internal perspective of your employees. Then you look at the outer world of your vendors, and then you look at your customers, and then you look at the communities you serve. Guess what? All of a sudden, you're responsible for a lot more than you really thought. But that should not terrify you. That should encourage you to know that you will make a difference in many, many more people's lives than you initially thought.
Right. So that's that view of perspective, in the sense that you recognize that it is not just, people are not just numbers. People are not just themselves. They are a representation of themselves, their families, their communities. A question I have for you is, I mentioned earlier about changing times, and you spoke recently about having to steward a bakery through COVID, right? How would you say the best CEOs that you've come across, or the people who are really successful and kind of thing, how adaptive are their visions to external circumstances, such as COVID, or such as things that they can't necessarily understand? One of the things that I feel that we've talked about and is this idea of the ABCs, and how healthy cultures can withstand any external forces for the most part, right? As long as there can be something that moves forward. But knowing that that's the case, how much does the CEO have to adapt vision, or have to adapt to these external circumstances in terms of how they lead a company?
Yeah, the metaphor I use is that it's not about adapting your vision, it's adapting to the circumstances that are present now that may interfere or block or constrain your vision. And so the metaphor I use is sailing. Okay. You can't sail in a straight line. Why? Because the winds and the currents are ever shifting. So yes, you got it as a CEO, you have to be looking at the external circumstance at all times. There could be an economic crash, could be a pandemic, it could be something else. But in either case, you you want to look at that constantly and adjust your sail and adjust your rudder because it's tacking, it's zigzagging you never change your bearing. Your bearing is the vision. That's where we want to end up. But you will change direction at all times as you're tacking. And it's important for your team to understand that because they may be confused. Well, we're changing direction. Yes, we're changing direction because we need to, because external conditions demand it, but we're not changing our goal. We're not changing our bearing. We're going to continue to go there. And it's about keeping your tacking narrow instead of broad. Don't go wandering off aimlessly somewhere. Come back when you need to come back. But you always have to be looking at that. So I do this exercise in a room. I'll tell you, okay, close your eyes and I want you to point to north. Okay, let's say there's 20 people. And then they open their eyes and everyone's pointing in different directions. Okay, someone gets lucky, gets in the right one, and they're all proud of themselves. But it was luck. And then I always had my compass on my phone. I said, okay, that's true north over there. Okay, now everyone point to true north. I said, then what is in business, you're going to get distracted. 95% of management is course correction. And what you need to be able to do is say, where's true north? Boom, and they point to that. And I would do it throughout the rest of the meeting. Where's true north? Where's true north? And eventually the true north is not the direction on the magnetic pole, is the direction of the organization. Where are we heading? Off course, something happened, and that's what we're trying to accomplish. There's a great, one of my favorite books in business right now is The 4 Disciplines of Execution. It's been out for a few years, but I always recommend it because it talks about the whirlwind. And the whirlwind is all the distraction that we face in business on a constant basis. So if you don't have a goal, then wherever you are is fine. And if you wander off course, maybe you aren't off course. I'm just serendipitously going through life. You can't do that. And the whirlwind's a distraction. I always ask the question, how many of you have been busy all day long and got nothing done? Okay. All you're doing is putting out fires, the demands of other people. And what you want to do is make sure that you're getting the things you have defined with intention as an organization, as an individual supporter to that organization. This is what I'm going to accomplish today to move us past our obstacles and our constraints, our self-imposed limitations.
With this understanding of what it means to be, a C-suite, there's probably a lot of hubbub that goes around like, oh, I'm going to make this thing into finally be the ultimate thing. And it sounds like we're, from your experience of everything that you're saying, it's like there's a lot about making sure that everyone's going in the same direction. There's a lot, and most of it is about perspective. And there's just a lot about the recognition of the fact that not only are you understanding the true north, but if that true north is going to be having to course correct for a bad culture or an unhealthy culture, there's going to be difficult decisions that you have to make in there. Right. And how, one of the things that we talk about, right, and everybody knows this, is that, or not everybody knows this, but this experience of what it means to make a difficult decision that feels like you are maybe cutting off somebody's livelihood, or maybe you are, you're having to make the hard choice that may not be nice, as to your point. How would you say that you advise people? I have an answer for how I advise people, but I'm curious, how would you advise people to be able to understand that they, the buck stops with them effectively within the company when they go into these positions, and therefore they're going to have to make difficult decisions? And how do they allow that to happen in their life?
Well, I think you need to be clear on what your stewardship is.
Okay.
If you're the C-suite, a CEO, COO, your mandate is to protect the business at large. You cannot sacrifice the entire business for 1 or 2 people.
Yeah.
If you have a bad apple, you just got to get them out of there. And it'd be fair, because all this is done in the public arena. How you treat someone when they're terminated reflects on everybody else. They're all watching you. Oh my God, that could happen to me. So if you're fair, and if you put them on a PIP, performance improvement plan, that's usually the first step to sort of document performance. If you do it with sincerity, really wanted to improve, then it's done fine. If it's just a process that HR uses to get someone out, then everybody gets to know that in the culture, they know how it operates. So you got to be really mindful of that. So I said about the culture, whatever you do, the culture is really important. But at the end of the day, you can be you can be hard but firm. Be hard on problems, kind to the people, but you need to make sure you have the accountability of what you need to do. I've terminated people that I've considered my friends. Now, they didn't talk to me for 10 years, but later on, I've had many people come back to me and said, you know what? You terminated me. I hated you, but you did me a favor. I needed that lesson. And that's fine. I don't look for that. That's just something that's happened as I've been in my career a long time. But you can, again, do not sacrifice the whole for the sake of a few that you are afraid as a leader to confront if they're not performing to expectations. The other thing that occurs, and this is sadly part of what happens, is that the environment changes dramatically. And all of a sudden, a team of people are irrelevant to what you need because the skill is no longer needed. And this is happening with AI a lot right now. There's people who are waking up going, oh my God, everything that I spent my entire career learning to do can now be replaced with some use of AI. And that's a scary place to be. Now, so if you don't want to become redundant, this is where the intellectual curiosity comes in. Keep learning. If you're a learning organization where you're always exploring new ways of adopting things and so forth and so on, don't be afraid of change. Change is the only constant you have. Embrace it, lean into it, and develop your skills even more. Then as an organization, if you have that kind of mindset where you're supporting people in their learning, then you will reimburse them for education or whatever the case would be to try and do that. I think we live in a really, really fantastic time. Scary as hell. Okay, there's a lot going on. Do not pretend to have the answers for what's going to happen next or what should I do. But I can tell you that if you are focused on the key indicators of your business, you're focused on the culture, you know where your competition's going, you look at the macro environment that you're operating within, and you remain nimble, you're fine. Another metaphor I use is we're in a whitewater world. Okay, and it's a class 5 wave every day. It's not a question of will you hit the rocks? You will hit the rocks. Okay, therefore, make sure you're in a rubber raft so it bounces off the rocks, which means your culture is flexible and fluid. It feels safety. They know what to do in a crisis, and they can maneuver around that. That's what the whole game's all about. And I just think it's fantastic that we had this opportunity to discuss this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And just to kind of add from the mystical perspective of what you're talking about in terms of, I love that you use the word stewarding. I kind of wanted to add a little piece into this, which is something that I talk a lot with the people that I work with is this understanding of we don't understand everybody's story that we are interacting with, right? We've talked about this before, about this nature of like, there's so much complexity that goes on within any person's life. But as a leader, you are stewarding your own story, and you're also stewarding the story of the company more so than almost anybody else's. And as a result of that, you can never forget what it is to steward the company. And especially if you're a founder, I'm not going to lie, most of the time, your story and your company's story are very parallel. They're very, very parallel, right? I've seen that countless times in which something that you've been dealing with, when I say, like I said at the very beginning, whatever your baggage is that you come into that company with as a founder is likely going to be amplified tenfold in your company, right? But if you're taking over a company, you're going to recognize that some of the dynamics that you wish that you could maybe get rid of, right? Or, I'm good. It's like moving to a different city. I used to, I came from a family that moved constantly all the time because they kept thinking that if they moved to a different place, they wouldn't be there, right? Like then, you couldn't bring, it's like, no, you pack yourself everywhere you go.
That's right. Wherever you go, there you are. Exactly.
Wherever you go, there you are. You can't get over the fact that you are going to absolutely bring yourself anywhere you go. And if you recognize this, and you recognize that every other person who's involved in your company is in the same boat. They may not have as much influence. Their story may not be influencing the company as much as yours is, which is where you can feel that bigness around what it means to be a C-suite executive. But effectively, you don't understand so many times what character you are playing in somebody else's story, right? And the more that you recognize that if something seems to make sense in every way, but there's just this one nagging thing of, oh, this person's my friend, or, oh, I'm going to lose this person, that is very likely your stuff. That is your stuff that is getting in the way of you stewarding the story. And you have no idea sometimes when you have to be the villain in somebody else's story, right? And we don't have control over that. And the more that we recognize that, we are all, as Ram Dass would say, we are all waking up. We're all in this process of trying to play out our stories. And sometimes you have to be the bad guy in somebody else's story, and that's okay, because ultimately, as a C-suite executive, you are trying to steward the story of the company. And that is, but everywhere you go, if you have a family, you are stewarding the story of your family. If you're in a partnership, you are helping with your partner, hopefully steward the story of your partnership. There's so many stories that we're withholding. When you're in that company, you recognize that, sometimes the company is going to become the bad guy for people, right? Not just you, but the company itself. And the more that we're able to move through these stories, the more that we're able to recognize that in 10 years' time, isn't that a wonderful thing? If you did it with kindness, if you did it, if you did it with alignment with your principles, if you did it with coherence, and you made these decisions, 10 years down the line, someone's going to finally recognize and see how their story played out such that you needed to fire them in that moment, right? And I'm not saying that's always the case. That's not a good justification, pre-justification. It's just a piece of faith, of non-secular faith that we can have, that these things are going to play out in the way that they need to. So yeah.
That was great. Well, that was a wonderful recap for this episode. I think you did a nice close on this. And for our listeners, if you want us to go any further in any one of these topics, please let us know. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
The Executive and the Mystic podcast, co-hosted by Fred LeFranc and Kristina Wiltsee, where wisdom meets business.